3, 2, 1.
Hello, my name is Shannon Fraser. I currently work for the National Trust in Northern Ireland, but for many years I was the National Trust for Scotland's Archaeologist for Eastern Scotland. And between 2004 and 2006, in partnership with my colleagues Hilary and Charlie Murray of Murray Archaeological Services, we undertook excavations on a crop mark site on the National Trust for Scotland's Crathes Castle estate, overlooking the banks of the River Dee near Banchory. And when we started, we really had no idea that one of the things that we'd be investigating was an extremely unusual site created by hunting and gathering communities and used by them over a hugely long expanse of time. Now, the crop marks lie in a field called the Warren Field on a terrace above the north bank of the River Dee. And from this place, the river flows eastwards for about 27 kilometres before it empties into the North Sea. So on this wee map, you can see the Crathes Castle estate here, or this blob here, and the Warren Field is just here, right in the middle of the estate. So if we zoom in to the estate itself, you can see the castle and the gardens and the home farm up to the left, all up here. You can then see the Warren Field here is in the middle. And then this is the Coy Burn running here to the right. That runs down into the Dee, and you can see here that it's actually been dammed to form a lake as part of the late 18th century landscaping of the castle grounds, but originally obviously just an ordinary burn running down towards the Dee. So our investigations of a complex of prehistoric archaeological sites in the Warren Field is actually one of the biggest archaeological projects that the National Trust for Scotland has undertaken in northeast Scotland. We began in 2004, which seems an awful long time ago now, and we carried out 3 seasons of fieldwork. And from start to finish, the project was really full of surprises. It was great. It proved to be a tremendously exciting piece of work. And we published the results of the excavations in 2009. And then we produced a short, more popular guide to the prehistory of the whole of the Crathes Castle estate in 2016, just so that visitors can get some information about these fascinating sites while they're actually on the property. But the story really begins, for archaeologists anyway, on a summer morning in 1976. Now, many of us of a certain age remember that glorious summer, 1976, which just went on and on. But for archaeologists, the really long period of dry heat was particularly memorable because a remarkable number of previously unknown archaeological sites were revealed as crop marks or different colour patterns in a ripening cereal crop. And the dry conditions were so intense that year that some sites, including some sites on Dee side, were actually showing up as parch marks in pasture, which, doesn't happen all that often. And by some wonderful serendipity, the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland had just set up an aerial survey programme. And that summer of 76 was their first flying season. So it was just a perfect summer to start. So from the aircraft, they took 3 photographs of crop marks that they could see in the Warren Field. And this is one of the photographs. And incidentally, that was the only time that the sites in that field have ever been caught on film. So here I've picked out a lot of the potential archaeological features that were showing up in the field that they saw that day. Now, we did investigate some of the smaller features, which you can see all the little arrows, and we did have a look at some of them as part of our programme. and they turned out to have a whole range of prehistoric dates. So they're belonging to all sorts of periods through time in prehistory. But what we found out later was that many years before, the Girl Guides used to use the Warren Field to camp in, and they dug a series of latrine pits there. And happily, we didn't chance upon any of those when we were doing our excavations. But just to let you know, that's what some of those dots on that photograph might just possibly be. Now, the other thing that you're seeing there is you're seeing some interesting geology. And you can see a whole series of stripes, these dark stripes. So you've got here, and then you've got a different set of stripes here. And what those stripes are the various channels of a braided river system of the late glacial period. So the river at this point is a whole series of smaller channels sort of intertwined and constantly moving rather than one big channel. And what you're seeing there is what eventually is going to become the River Dee. And gradually it's cutting its way downwards, southwards, down to its present bed, its present floodplain, which would be to the left of the photo as you're looking at it. So the River Dee is off to the left. And so what you're seeing is this is an older series of channels, and then these are slightly younger series of channels. So at this point you can see they've now got the same alignment as the Dee today, and they're just starting to cut themselves down off to the left of the photograph till they get to where the Dee presently is. Now, by the time people come here and start making these features in the landscape, this is now a completely dry landscape, and the River Dee is where the River Dee is now. So none of what we're going to have a look at occurred by the river. It all occurred in relation to the river as it is today, which is about 10 minutes walk away. So you're close, but these are definitely dry land sites rather than riverbank sites. So in 1976, two crop marks at Crathes were immediately obvious as important archaeological sites. So the first at the top is what appears to be a massive line of very large pits, stretching for nearly 100 meters along a northeast-southwest axis, running along what would have been a sandbar in this late glacial river system. So this area here would have been, long before these pits ever went in, it would have been a sandbar with the river channels running on either side of it. And so after the river had moved southwards, that sandbar would probably have been a slightly raised ridge in the landscape. Now, if you go into that field today, it's just flat. And I think it's because it's been flattened by centuries and centuries of ploughing, which we know has been going on in this location since at least the medieval period, and probably much, much longer than that. So all of that ploughing over those centuries has just flattened out what was once, I think, more of a bump in the landscape. So this is a type of site which is simply called, boringly and descriptively, a pit alignment. Now, the second major site down here, which sits on the edge of one of those old river terraces, is what appeared from the photo to be a rectangular timber structure. It's about 8 meters wide and about 23 meters long. And from that photo, it looked like the trenches for timber walls of a structure. And you can maybe just see these two dots at either end, which are big pits which once held posts. So both of those site types are rare in northeast Scotland, and the timber structure is just rare generally. And when we actually excavated that building, we discovered that it had been built around 6,000 years ago, at a time when really a major transformation of life is taking place here with the introduction of new people and new agricultural practices to this part of Scotland. So that's a hugely interesting and important site in its own right, but that will have to be a story for another day, because we're supposed to be concentrating on Mesolithic Deeside here. So if we go back to the pit alignment then, pit alignments have a very broad date range, anything from the prehistoric period right down to the 18th and 19th century. And their nature is also very diverse, and their function. So they might be the traces of hedge lines and tree lines. They might be the remains of 19th and early 20th century shooting butts. They might be open pits, possibly once associated with an earthen bank, or instead of a bank, with piles of earth mounded up next to the pits, essentially the soil that's come out of the pits. And the thing about pit alignments is that more often than not, there's just no artifacts within them, which might give a clue to their date. And also, there's often no material suitable for radiocarbon dating. So generally, all that you can say, if you've eliminated possibilities like a 19th century boundary of trees, for example, is to say, well, this is probably prehistoric, which is pretty vague. It's not particularly helpful. So pit alignments have always been quite tricky. Prehistoric pit alignments might have been practical or symbolic boundaries. They might have been both. They might have been neither. In the south of England, for example, there's a 3,000-year-old pit alignment, and that's been found to run along precisely the same route as the medieval parish boundary. And that medieval parish boundary is still a local government administrative boundary today. And so I think that's just a fascinating example of people using that same boundary in the landscape over thousands of years. So the nature and the function of the boundary has changed, but the line in the landscape has remained the same, which is just great. So apart from the fact that our pit alignment at Crathes didn't relate to any previous field boundaries on old estate plans, and at Crathes our oldest only takes us back to the late 18th century, and so therefore we knew it was not a relatively modern line of boundary trees. We just really didn't have much to go on when we began our investigations in 2004. And this is literally just the very beginning. This slide you're seeing, we're just taking the very first bits of turf off. And much of the excavation was actually carried out by volunteers, many of whom were students undertaking Aberdeen University's course in Scottish archaeology through the Department of Continuing Education. Now, the pit alignment took a while to find, because the upper levels of the material that was within the pits it was so similar to the surrounding alluvial gravels into which the pits had been dug, that the outlines of the pits were pretty much impossible to see when we first took the turf off, which was a bit disconcerting, I have to say. And the problem was exacerbated by the incredibly dry conditions of that first spring that we first started work. It meant that you just couldn't really see anything in the soil. And in the end, it was only when my colleagues Hilary and Charlie Murray actually came to the site really early one morning, when the dew was still very heavy. And at that point, they suddenly saw the pits really, really clearly, because the pits were holding the water just that bit longer than the surrounding undisturbed soil. And that's, of course, precisely why the pits had shown up so clearly as crop marks, because they're holding, in that very free draining soil, they're holding water just that wee bit longer. And so this is the photograph that they then took that morning before we lost them again. And in the photograph, you can see as well that there are a number of post holes close to the pits. You can see 3 of them there just in the foreground, for example. And those are just too small to have ever shown up as crop marks. You just would never see that on an aerial photograph. So the sites have more complexity than what you're seeing from the crop marks. So altogether, we actually revealed 12 pits, but we didn't necessarily reveal the whole of this line. So there may be 2 more pits to the southwest that we didn't look at, and there may be 2 or possibly 3 more to the northeast, going on what you're seeing in the aerial photograph. And that would make a total of 17 pits extending for about 90 meters. So it's possible that that there are a few more than the 12 pits that we excavated. And at the southwestern end, which is just at the left on the photograph that you're seeing there, we wanted to investigate what seemed to be a sort of crescentic terminal to the monument. It doesn't just run straight all the way. It seems to have a wee dip. And so you can just see there, that's where we've revealed 3 of the pits in that wee curving arc at the southwest end, where it starts to deviate from that, from the main line. So we revealed 12. We actually excavated 7 of the pits in the alignment, always wanting to just leave some things completely untouched for the future. You never know what new techniques and new thoughts you might have in the future. So being able to go back, allow people the chance of going back, as I think all archaeologists would say is the right thing to do. So we excavated 7, and they ranged from 1 meter in diameter to 2.5 meters in diameter, and in depth from about 0.5 meter to about 1.5 meters in depth. So they're reasonably big pits. And you can see there from the plan that there are some various post holes scattered in among there as well. Now, despite the range and size, the pits had all seen a very similar sequence of events, actually. So first, quite a deep and then pretty much immediately after the digging, because the alluvial gravels here, literally as soon as you dig them out, they all start to rush back in to the bottom of the pit. Practically when you come back from tea break, you'll find loads and loads of gravel has fallen back into the pit. So we could tell that pretty much immediately after these pits had been dug, a deposit of charcoal-rich material had been placed in the bottom. And after this, a very slow, gradual infilling of the pit occurred as the edges weathered and as the upcast material from the digging of the pit, which had been placed all around the edges, began to slip back in. And it seems that at times there was activity around the pits which disturbed that upcast a bit, and it making it erode down back into the body of the pit. And there were fragments of charcoal mixed in with that eroding material, which suggests that fires were being lit reasonably close to the pits. And that charcoal is becoming incorporated into the upcast, and then the upcast is all flowing back down into the pits. Now that movement and erosion back into the pits, that's interspersed with periods when people don't seem to have been doing things directly around the pits, because that slippage of material stops, and the surfaces in the pit begin to stabilize, and vegetation begins to grow on the open surfaces within the pit. And the thin, darker layers, which hopefully you'll just be able to see on that slide where the arrows are pointing, that's showing you a couple of examples of those vegetating surfaces, those slightly darker strips, which is where vegetation is starting to grow and that erosion is stopping. And then the whole erosion process starts again. So disturbance, some sort of disturbance, people are disturbing around again, and you get that interspersed through time. Eventually, people come back to each pit, which by now is just little depressions really in the ground. They come back to each pit, they redig it a bit, and you can see there, I've shown you that line is showing that very last redigging. So they dig that out again. And again, they place quite a charcoal-rich deposit in it. Now, there are almost no artifacts in any of the pits that we excavated, which is, as I say, fairly typical for a pit alignment of any date, except there were very few pieces of worked flint and stone, which suggested to us a prehistoric date. At least we were beginning to get a feel for what we were working with. But the flints, for example, that we found, they just weren't of a form that could give us an idea of exactly when in prehistory these pits were being dug. So when the results of the radiocarbon dating came through, there was generally wild excitement all round, because it turns out that these pits were dug over an extended period of time between about 8,200 BC and 6,700 BC. With this line of pits gradually coming into being, if you like, rather than being created all as one event where they go and they dig 17 pits all at once. Instead, it's just gradually these pits being added to the line. Now, because we haven't excavated all of the pits, we haven't even dated all of the pits, we can't say exactly when the first pit and the last pits were dug, but we can certainly see that pits are being added to that line over time. So for this pit, for example, our earliest dates actually come from the layer of vegetation that had begun to grow on the soil, eroding back into the pit that you can see about halfway down here. And here, so just in here. So that means that that pit must have been dug at some point before 7,260 to 6,690 BC. Now we can see activity then is recurring around the pits right through into the mid-6th millennium BC. And then we've got this period of up to maybe 2,500 years in which people's activity here just becomes archaeologically invisible. So the site may have gone out of use, or it may be that, whatever people were doing here at that time just hasn't left traces for us to find. So here in this particular pit, you can see that there's a huge time gap occurring between those last two layers. And that very final activity you can see at the top, in which people rework what are by now quite small depressions in the ground, that all happens around 3,800 to 3,700 BC. So in all of the pits that had that last reworking, that is something that's all happening at the same time, given that you've got a 100-year stretch there. So they're not necessarily all dug on the same Saturday afternoon, but it's all being dug in a quite close timescale archaeologically. Now, what we don't know is at what point the various posts associated with the alignment were erected, because there wasn't any material suitable for dating in the ones that we excavated. So these were incredibly important results, because it meant that this line of pits was created by relatively mobile hunting and gathering communities beginning around 10,000 years ago, which was a surprise, I have to say. Whatever the actual function of the pits might have been, this was the first time that we'd seen in Britain what, in its final form, is a substantial and formal monument. This is a big line of pits stretching for some 90 meters through the landscape. And that's the first time we'd seen that sort of thing happening at such an early date in what's termed the Mesolithic period. So up to that point, archaeologists had found a few substantial pits, yes, created by these early communities, but they were usually isolated examples, and they were usually associated with inhabitation sites. There were also a couple of examples of large posts being erected by hunter-gatherers, most famously in the Stonehenge car park. And so far, only one or two other Mesolithic pit alignments have been positively identified since our excavations in 2004 to 6 in Perthshire. Now, the other extremely exciting aspect is that here we had unequivocal evidence of an ancient site being reused in the early Neolithic period. So that's, as I say, our very final act of redigging the pits and deliberately filling them up again. In this case, at the very beginning of the Neolithic, when agricultural practices and associated products are just starting to be used and brought into Scotland. Now, in the past, we'd had tantalizing hints that people in the past might have been revisiting sites whose importance stretched back over thousands of years, but just wasn't anything provable. And what's really interesting is that in the last few years, more Mesolithic pits have been coming to light in Scotland, including on Deeside, which also have clear evidence for people digging out those upper levels in the earliest Neolithic. So there's a really interesting pattern of activity that seems to be emerging there, which is going to bear, I think, a lot of research, be really interesting. So it might be a functional act in a sense, in that it's easier to dig a pit where the earth has been broken before. It might be partly a way of acknowledging the past presence of people in a particular place. So a more symbolic act, maybe. It might be a combination of the both. So I think there's still a lot to learn there, which is really exciting. Now, in terms of the landscape setting, we were lucky enough to be able to retrieve pollen grains from the Mesolithic levels of the pits, despite the fact that these weren't waterlogged situations. And although they don't by any means give a complete picture of what the environment was like, we can at least say that the pits were dug within a birch hazel woodland, which would have been reasonably light and airy. So the analysts suggested that it would have been, a pleasant place to walk through, with no dense undergrowth of brambles, for example, and good visibility. You could see ahead of you where you were going. The ground cover seems to have been mostly heather and bilberry with some grass. So quite a nice open woodland to move through. So the big question, of course, was what was the pit alignment for, which was difficult. So we looked at a number of possibilities, and to be honest, we had to rule most of them out the more we looked at them. So, for example, they weren't pits for quarrying flint, because these gravels just don't contain flint. And flint quarrying, as opposed to surface collection, isn't yet attested in Scotland anyway until many thousands of years later. One strong possibility that we looked at was that they formed a series of pitfall traps for animals such as deer and boar. So there, you dig a big, deep pit. Often you find that you put a series of stakes in the bottom, pointy stakes sticking upwards. And then you cover that pit with brushwood and material leaves so that you can't see it. And then you drive animals towards your pit. The animal doesn't see it, it rushes over it, and it collapses into the pit. So that's basically how a pit trap works. But although pit traps arranged in formal lines are definitely known from prehistoric and later periods, both in Britain and in Europe, the pits are generally much bigger than the pits at Crathes. They're very often oval or square, and they very often have a sort of a funnel-shaped profile, which makes it harder for the animal to get out. Our pits seem just a bit too small to have been effective to operate in that kind of way, even for smaller animals like boar. We're finding it difficult to really envisage them being particularly effective. Also, when pitfall traps are arranged in a line, they usually have stretches of fencing running in between the pits, so that when they're driven towards them, the animals head for the gaps in the fences, and so they fall in the pits. And we just weren't catching evidence for that. The deliberate deposition of that charcoal-rich material at the base of almost all the pits, that also didn't seem to fit all that well with a trapping scenario. We just couldn't really see why you would be doing that if this is a pitfall trap. So it was difficult. The location of the alignment, the Crathes alignment in the landscape, it's not particularly convincing for hunting either, to be honest. It doesn't utilize any natural feature which would help driving deer and other game towards it. In fact, it's the steep-sided glen of the Coy Burn, which, if you remember, is very close by. It's literally just at the top of this slide in here. That's a much better place into which to hunt down animals without even the need for pitfall traps. You can drive them into that very narrow gorge and effectively pick them off. Now, interestingly, there's a scattered group of Mesolithic pits, big Mesolithic pits, discovered recently further down the Dee, further towards the sea at Mill Timber. And they are more likely candidates for pitfall traps. They've certainly been interpreted as that by the excavators. They're much deeper with almost vertical sides. And as at Crathes, they were dug over a very long period of time, but they aren't arranged in a line. They're just sort of a random scatter. But they were dug very close to the riverbank, so they're effectively running right alongside this braided riverbank, which is what the Dee is at this early point in the Mesolithic. And that makes more sense for trapping, because you could drive the animals down towards the water's edge and into your hidden pits. So we just felt that hunting traps wasn't doing it either. There was then the discovery of cremation pits in County Limerick, which date to roughly the same period as the Crathes pits, and that provided us with yet another possible function to explore. But there again, there was just no evidence at all of cremated bone deposits in these pits. And it's also clear that our pits were left open to weather naturally rather than having been filled back in, which, if not impossible, would, I think, seem rather unlikely, in the case of burial. So, didn't leave us with much, I have to say. What we were left with is the possibility that the pit alignment operated in some senses as a monument. In other words, that it had some sort of symbolic or ceremonial role. So the deliberate placement of charcoal-rich material in the pits at the start of their lives, combined with that evidence for intermittent activity and for the gradual development of the alignment in which that place is revisited over a considerable period of time, those are features which could conceivably derive from symbolic activity, as is that very formal disposition of the pits in that line along a low natural ridge in the landscape. So in such a scenario, a whole range of activities might have been invested with symbolic significance. So you can imagine the excavation of each pit, the removal of the soils and gravels and their placement all around the edges of the pits. The activities connected with the preparation, the lighting, and the use of fires nearby. The gathering together of some of the resulting ashes and their placement within the pits. And although undated, there is also the possibility, at least, that the posts which were interspersed among the line of pits might at different times have formed part of that suggested ceremonial activity. Now, superficially, this doesn't appear to have been a visually dominant monument in the landscape, but think we should remember that when the alignment was first created, it may have been far more obvious for the heaps of upcast earth than actually for the pits themselves. That would have made it very visible, even in the open woodland that we saw suggested by the pollen evidence. And we should also be aware of the potential for the contribution of other more ephemeral elements to the feel of the place. So think about offerings of fruits, of nuts and other foodstuffs perhaps, or flowers and other vegetation, feathers, that sort of thing. Carvings might have embellished the trees amongst which the alignment threaded, and indeed, who knows, some of the trees themselves might have formed an integral part of the monument. Particular items of decorative clothing or other organic material and objects, all used in ceremonies around the pits, maybe they were left behind deliberately. And I think, like the rags tied to the trees around the Clootie Wells, which still survive in some parts of Scotland today, an accumulation of organic material in different stages of decay can actually produce a visibly really distinctive effect. And I think actually that's definitely something to think about just for when you're thinking about any archaeological site, just thinking about the difference it would make having all of the organic materials around that place. Just makes a completely different picture, I think, in your mind. Now, what such ceremonies might have been and what they meant remains elusive. And given the huge span of time that were involved, they aren't likely to have remained the same over the life of the monument either. The monument might have operated in all sorts of different ways over that huge span of time. What we can do perhaps is just to catch the faintest traces of specific activities and seasonal rhythms, though. That's one thing we maybe can have a stab at. In one of the deliberate deposits in the bottom of the pits, we found very minute fragments of burnt bone and the seeds of fat hen, which is a traditional foodstuff. So here we might see perhaps the consumption of food as part of activities connected with the pits in midsummer to mid-autumn, while a burnt fragment of hazelnut shell from another pit may indicate a presence in mid to late autumn. And in one of those stabilizing vegetation layers that I spoke about, the environmental specialist identified charcoal from alder twigs that had been freshly nibbled by a bank vole, which is this little critter here. Now, because these guys do this nibbling at particular times of the year, we can say that in this case, the wood was collected and burnt in either the summer or the winter. And incidentally, as far as I know, that's the first time that a bank vole has been identified in a British Mesolithic habitat through its little, interestingly, not the bank vole itself, but the little nibble marks that it left on that piece of wood, which is amazing. Now, that all chimes in well with the suggestion that the substantial concentrations of Mesolithic worked stone tools, which are found along the major salmon rivers in Scotland, including the River Dee, represent repeated visits over the centuries in which lots of people gathered together at times of year when they could take advantage of the seasonal abundance of fish. And they could use that opportunity to exchange information and goods, to celebrate maybe various rites of passage, to undertake religious activities and so on, when all these disparate groups are coming together at these specific times of the year. Now today, the salmon and the sea trout run in the Dee at various points between February and September. And there are certainly enormous concentrations of Mesolithic tools and the debris from their manufacture along the banks of the Dee at Crathes, only 10 minutes walk away from the pits. And this slide is just showing you in the sort of wine-colored dots where those have been found so far. The pit alignment itself seems to sit somewhat apart from this busy riverbank focus. So, here's where the pit alignment is up here. Oops. And the impression is, in a sense, maybe of isolation. There's in location, it's a bit separate. Also, in the fact that there's almost no artifacts there. So the impression is of isolation, or maybe of a place visited only occasionally, or by a restricted number of people. And it may be that while large gatherings were congregating in the area when the fish were running, and they're all down right at the D, perhaps only particular individuals or small selective groups spent time at the monument. That's certainly a possibility. The other possibility, of course, is, as I sort of was hinting at before, is that it may just be that whatever people are doing at that doesn't need stone tools and the sort of things that you're actually going to find afterwards. So it's a bit difficult, but on the face of it, it looks like this where the pits are is quite a different part of the landscape than all of this busy activity happening down at the riverbanks. Now, one of the most tantalizing pieces of evidence that we obtained actually came from geochemical analysis. And here you can see Professor Andy Meharg in one of our pits. He was at the time at University of Aberdeen, and what he's doing there is he's using a portable X-ray fluorescence machine to do some initial spot testing of the constituents, the mineral constituents of the different layers in the soil, which then led him to go on and do some in-depth analyses of the soil. Now, he discovered very highly elevated levels of copper, of lead, and of silver in a number of the charcoal-rich layers, as well as in some other layers. Now, as you can imagine, this was pretty surprising, not to say perplexing, given that metals don't start to be used in Scotland until many thousands of years later. So what on earth were we doing with copper, lead, and silver in highly elevated levels in some of these layers? We discovered that the source of these metals is likely to have been rock outcrops in the Pass of Ballater, which is some 40 kilometers further up the Dee. And here at the pass, they're found in association with a whole range of spectacularly colored minerals. Now today, the cliffs in the Pass of Ballater are very impressive still, but they've been heavily, heavily quarried over the centuries. In 8000 BC, they would also have been wonderfully colored, stained purple, green, and yellow by the fluorites that were within them, and the colors are being dragged down by the rain as the water is streaming down the cliffs. It's pulling down the colors of these minerals. So it must have been really quite spectacular originally. So, and this is really where we're at the moment moving into real speculation. It might be that the Pass of Ballater was a special place in the Mesolithic where people collected colorful minerals. And there is some evidence from other parts of Britain that unusual features in the landscape and colors were attractive to people in the Mesolithic. So there is a little bit of evidence there. So it may be that what they're doing is collecting colorful minerals from the Pass of Ballater and then crushing up these minerals to make pigments, perhaps. So maybe we might think of a scenario in which objects which are used in ceremonies at the Crathes pit alignment, which of course is 40 kilometers away, are maybe decorated with such pigments. That those pigments might carry with them traces of those associated metals, so traces of the lead, the silver, and the copper that were in close association with the rocks at the Pass of Ballater. And that then maybe these wooden objects or other objects which have been decorated with these pigments, perhaps they might have been burnt as part of the closing rites and their ashes deposited in the pits. Does that maybe explain why we have these you're getting then the traces of lead and silver and copper. Who knows? At least it would be consistent with potential ritual behavior being enacted at the monument, at the pits. Similarly, if you were to add powdered copper to a fire, you would get green flames. And so, you think, well, interesting effects like that might well have played a part in ceremonial. So are they possibly actually crushing up rock that has copper in it to then give you these effects? Who knows? The other thing to think about is that those fluorites, those brightly colored rocks, minerals that are being found at the Pass of Ballater, some fluorites have really quite strange properties. Some of them glow in the dark when they're heated or when they're crushed. Now, that sort of thing would certainly add a frisson to ritual activities at the pits if you were able to make things glow in the dark out of nowhere. A lot more research would need to be done here, though, to even really begin to understand how these elevated levels of these metals came to be in some of the pits. But it could be really interesting one day to explore that better. Now, one of the other things we did look at was the possibility that the pit alignment had astronomical connections. And if I just explain this rather I find these astronomical images just a bit mind-boggling. So it does take a little while just to get your mind around what this is actually showing you. So I find it helps for me to get my bearings with what these are telling me. This is effectively a representation of the landscape at the Crathes pits in around 8,200 BC, and the sky, effectively, and the horizon. And you're standing in the center of the pits. And I find it's easier to imagine that strip as a big, big, big paper strip. And then if you glue the two ends of it that you're seeing together, so you've got a big, big paper strip circle, and imagine yourself standing in the middle of it and looking around. You're looking around at an image, a graphic representation of the landscape at Crathes. And so the point of view is you're standing right in the center of the line of pits. And these dotted lines are you looking down when you're actually looking down the alignment itself. That's what you're seeing. So that's how to try and get your mind around what you're seeing here. And then these different colored lines are showing you the path of the sun and the moon at specific points of the year through the sky. So hopefully I always find these, like, my heart sinks when I see one of these things, and it takes me a while to get my mind around it. So at such an early date in prehistory, if we're going to consider any astronomical relationship, we're going to have to do that in very broad terms. We are not talking about pinpoint accuracy in the Hubble telescope here. We're talking about very, very broad associations that anybody just standing in a field can see, remembering that you're a person who has an incredibly intimate knowledge of your landscape and your horizons. So the pits, yes, they're laid out in a line, but it's a very straggly line. It's not like, straight as a die. So when we decided to look for possible alignments on celestial events occurring along that line, so if I was looking to the northeast or if I was looking to the southwest along the pit alignment, the astronomers looked at a band of sky which was 10 degrees wide, to see whether anything was happening of interest in that 10-degree strip. So to do that, they had to reconstruct the night sky at around 8,000 BC, and then they had to check any correspondence with the rising or the setting of the sun at solstices and equinoxes. They looked at the rising or the setting of the moon at its most northerly and southerly points. They looked at the rising and setting again of the 10 brightest stars in the sky, and finally of the Pleiades, which of course, being a very distinct cluster, is again something that you can identify now as something that someone in the past would also have been able to identify quite clearly. That's as far as they could go, because any other potential specific link with, I don't know, a particular star would just be too subtle for us to identify today. We just couldn't find it. We would have no idea that some random star was important in the Mesolithic, and therefore where it rose and set was important. So that's as far as we could go. And as it turned out, we found no significant celestial event was tied in with that physical alignment of the pits. So we didn't find any particularly interesting events. However, the astronomers did note that a cyclical phenomenon in which the full moon appears just to roll along the southern horizon at the time of the summer solstice might have been observable from the site, dependent on the amount of tree cover. Now, this is incredibly difficult to see, and I guarantee you probably won't see this unless you've got this on a mega screen on your wall, but there is a red line that runs here. And that's the line of the moon at its most southerly point. And that's in midsummer. It just pops up and it just literally rolls along the hills, and then it just pops down again, which must be quite, it's actually, I've never seen it, must be quite an interesting phenomenon to watch. I must do that one day, actually. Now, we need to remember that because this monument lay in open birch woodland, we just can't be sure how visible that horizon would be. So if any sight lines were possible, they are of course more likely to have been available in the winter and the spring when the leaves were off the trees. So whether a midsummer phenomenon, which is what this moon rolling moon is, whether that would have been visible is a big question. But it's just something to remember that there is a possibility that there was a deliberate connection there, that people were interested in being able to see the moon doing that from that particular point in the landscape. Now, some years after we published our excavations, a team of researchers from Birmingham University did some further work on astronomical connections at Crathes. And they drew attention to the fact that when viewed from the site of the pit alignment, the southern horizon is also of interest in that the sunrise at midwinter solstice rises from the V shape of one of the major north-south passes through the mountain range south of the D. And again, the scale of this, very hard to see, but you can just see there the midwinter sunrise, and it's actually coming out of when you see it in the landscape, it is quite a distinct V-shaped valley. I'd have to say, though, that it's one of those things that you know it's there because you know it's there, and you know the importance of it because you know that what that represents is a pass which is going down through the mountains, one of the very few mountain passes which allows you easy access further down south. So they highlighted that. Now, being a midwinter event, perhaps more likely that might have been visible from the pit alignment with the leaves off the trees. Again, we just have no idea. And we don't know whether, in fact, it's just chance or whether that was a purposeful connection. It just adds another possible element to the symbolic significance that the monument once held. Now, the Birmingham researchers took this rather further, and they suggested that the pit alignment might have been used for some of its history to mark the passage of time. And the idea, I'm going to simplify this immensely because I find this quite difficult to understand, but anyway, bear with me. The idea is that observation of the moon allows you to divide time up into periods of about 30 days. And if you want to progress that a bit further, you can start to link specific periods of 30 days, months, with specific seasons of the year. So what we call February today always falls at a particular horrible cold time of year. Now, ultimately, you end up with this complex calendrical system like the ones that we use today. But in the earliest, simplest stages, in which you're just more generally tracking the passage of time, one of the things that you do need to find a way of doing is correcting the drift of those months, those 30-ish day periods of time, against the seasons. And the reason that you need to do that is because, as I'm sure you're all aware, the solar year, so the seasonal year, doesn't divide equally into lunar months. Of course, we've just had a leap year to try and deal with that in our sophisticated, complex calendrical systems that we use today. So because it doesn't divide equally into lunar months, with time, your seasons and your specific months will get out of sync. So what we today call February, if we didn't keep correcting it, it would end up in a very hot period of the year, for example. So if that is important to you, if that's something that you want to do, link specific months with specific times of the year, an easy way, I say, to bring it all back together again is to observe the sun at a known point, such as the solstices. So you know exactly where you are in the solar year because you can see the midwinter sun rising or setting, or the midsummer sun rising or setting. So the Birmingham team's suggestion is that one way in which the pits were used was to mark the passing of each lunar month. And they said perhaps by inserting a stake in each pit as each month moves along. And we did get some evidence, minimal, but some evidence for stakes having been inserted and removed in 2 of the pits that we excavated. And then they said that observation of the midwinter sunrise, which was easily identifiable because it rises out of that notch on the horizon, so you know when it does that, you know that that's midwinter sunrise. That would then give you the fixed point in time that you needed to correct your drift of the seasons. Now, all of that, of course, depends, again, on that southern horizon being visible from the pit alignment in wintertime so that you can see the midwinter sun, and we just can't answer that question. The other thing to remember is that if the pits were ever used for this type of marking of time, that's an aspect of the monument which must have been acquired at a certain point in its development, not at the beginning, because as we've seen, these pits are dug gradually over hundreds of years. They aren't all just dug, each one, all my months, all at once, and then there we go. Similarly, as I said, although we revealed 12 pits, the crop marks indicate that there might be as many as 17 in the line. And the Birmingham researchers made a lot of the 12 pits, naturally. So it doesn't really fit very well with calculations of 12 months. So personally, I remain unconvinced about this whole lunar month connection with the Crathes pit alignment. I just don't think it works. I don't think there's any calendrical significance. I think, as far as I'm willing to go, is that at some point in its long life, one of the various things that may have happened at the monument was a marking of the passing of time by observing the rolling moon effect at midsummer or the rising of the midwinter sun from its V-shaped valley, if any of that was visible through the trees. So the Crathes pit alignment is really special because it makes you think quite hard, actually, but particularly because it's the first of its kind to be identified as having been created by hunting and gathering communities, whatever its function. And excitingly, in recent years, another alignment has been excavated at Well Hill in Strathearn, which seems to have some similar features and which has also produced Mesolithic dates And also, interestingly, evidence for reworking in the tops of the pits in the earliest Neolithic. So it's going to be really interesting to see what that site has to tell us and how it has to add to the story. I mean, at the end of the day, we may well never really know what places like this were and how they changed function and or their meaning over such an immense span of time. But with more sites to work with, we may come to a more detailed understanding of hunter-gatherer ways of life. So I hope that that's given you a wee bit of an insight into the earliest history of what is now Crathes Castle estate. If you're interested in the deep detail, the excavation report is published by Oxbow Books. For a lighter summary, I wrote a wee guide to the whole range of prehistoric sites on the estate, which is available from the National Trust for Scotland. And perhaps when we've been liberated into the countryside once more, who knows when that will be, if you head up to Crathes Castle in the future, you can pop up to look at that field, which first leapt back into focus in 1976. And, see what you think about what people might have been doing there some 10,000 years ago, which have left, these really fascinating traces for us to puzzle over. So, good luck.